Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I just wanted to try and clear up everything at work so that I don't get a bunch of calls during this recording because
Yeah.
now is kind of a busy time of day at the job, so I'm getting a lot of emails and texts and stuff like that. So
Okay.
um, I told them not to bother me for an hour, and I just resolved the last issue, so I should be good.
Okay.
As long as you don't
Sounds good.
fuck around and make like a 2 hour review, I should be fine.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what I can do. Yes. Always a mystery.
Yeah, no, there's no mystery. It'll be 2 hours. Spoiler alert. It's gonna be
Uh-oh.
long.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Okay. You all set?
Yes.
Hang on, where the hell are my notes? Give me 1 second. Okay, here they are.
Sure.
I don't have a lot of notes, but good?
Yes.
Okay. So Vampyr is a film by a filmmaker that we definitely should be exploring. The funny thing is, when I picked this movie, I picked it because it was just a random horror movie that I remember seeing a while ago that I liked. But then I didn't realize Dreyer did it. And I'm actually a big fan of Dreyer because he did another film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is one of my favorite silent films. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised when I realized he directed it. I didn't know that coming into it.
Yeah, I didn't either. When you mentioned Vampyr, I sort of had memories of a silent vampire movie, but I couldn't tell you who directed it or anything. I just remembered seeing it many years ago. But yes, I too saw The Passion of Joan of Arc and made a big impression. So interesting. This is the same guy, and this is the very next film he made, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of time in between both because both of these were huge financial flops.
Yeah, I know the critics weren't too fond of Vampyr when it came out.
Mhm. Yeah. So Carl Theodor Dreyer he's kind of not prolific because during this time where you had no TV, films were released a lot more frequently. And you'd have directors during the time that he was making films that would have, sometimes 50 to 150 films released throughout the course of their career. And he's more in line with filmmakers today, where there are like several years, sometimes in between each film he made. So for his time, he wasn't very prolific. But for now, like if you look at his total films he made throughout his career, it's a decent amount compared to today's standards. But he wasn't considered a very prolific filmmaker, very artistic in the sense that he wasn't really concerned about commercial success. He was more so concerned about a certain vision that he had, uh, and that made his films a little bit more long-lasting um, than some of his contemporaries, but also not as financially successful.
Carl Dreyer, he seems like he was more comfortable as a silent filmmaker. He did a lot of his work, and most of his work in the silent era. And this movie, Vampyr, was the first film that he made that was kind of a sound film, but it actually seems more like a silent film. And I think he was afraid of sound. He really wasn't too sure about it, so he kind of did it like it was a silent film. And much like Charlie Chaplin, who was kind of the same way, Chaplin resisted doing sound films for many years. In fact, doing Modern Times in 1936, which was really late for a silent film. This one was 4 years earlier, but still the same kind of thing where it does have sound on it. There is sound, there is sound effects, but it's basically a silent film as we kind of know it. Um, and I think part of the reason for that is the European market as well. They had to make their films available in several different languages, and so that was difficult. With a silent film, you could just replace the title cards, and you basically could send the film out. So I think he felt if he reduced the amount of dialogue, kept it to a minimum, that it would be easier to market the film, and I think he was just more comfortable. in that silent film style, because he really didn't do that many after this. He really had a sparse career in sound.
Yeah, in my research for this, I couldn't nail down exactly why there was so little dialogue. Some of it was he was resistant to it, you'd read. Other places you'd read he shot most of it silent. Then it was late in production that they decided to move to sound. You're right, the language thing was one of it too, because it was supposed to be done in three different languages, even though it's impossible to find the English version at this point. And also, the other thing I read was during one of the screenings, they were laughing at the movie because the dialogue was so stilted. So because of that, it was Dreyer's decision to cut out a lot of the dialogue because it didn't come off right, and it could have came off badly because this was the very early days of sound, and it was they were still trying to figure it out, and you didn't have a lot of mobility. You just had to be very static when you were doing it, and also the fact that it was being done in three different languages that could have contributed to the stilted dialogue. Did these actors actually know three languages? Were they doing it phonetically and they didn't even know what they were saying? A lot of that can lead to, you know, bad scenes. So whatever reason, it does come off as a silent film more so than a talkie. Another thing that I noticed too is the performances. There were some actors where they felt like modern performances. Like this feels like how someone would act in a modern film. But some of the actors, even in the same scenes, were acting like it was a silent film. They were doing the over exaggerations and the, you know, the cartoonish, over the top acting as we know it now. But they were acting as if they knew they were in a silent film. So it was the contrast. I believe it was one scene where the doctor gets shot and killed, and the young woman and the older lady were hugging, and the older woman, she was crying and she was holding her and consoling her, but the young woman that she was holding was just like waving her arms in the air and flailing about. I'm like, are these two people in two separate movies here? You know, so
Yeah, well, I guess one of the other things is that he used a lot of non-actors in this movie. Like a lot of these people, this was their first movie and it was their last movie. But there's a strange mix because some of them are actually accomplished actors. I think Sybil Schmitz, who plays one of the two daughters,
oh,
Leon.
Sybil, I know her.
Yeah. Well, she did appear in some movies. She did a few movies, and she actually died young, at age 45. You know, it's a theme that I've mentioned before, but I find there's often someone who died young during a film, and or you know, someone in a film died young, and she did die young at age 45 of drug overdose, suicide, I believe. Um, but you know, the other woman, Rena Mandel, who plays Giselle, her sister, this was her only film. You know, so it's like one actress who has some experience and one actress who has no experience. So that could be part of what's going on. The only question is it the experienced silent actors who are doing the sort of less good performances, or is it the non-experienced actors who are doing the less good performances? I haven't tracked through to try and figure out, you know, who exactly is, you know, inexperienced and who is experienced, but it's an interesting question.
Mhm. Another interesting thing is that this isn't the first director we've spotlighted that has used a lot of real people instead of actors. We also have John Cassavetes when we did A Woman Under Influence, and last week when we did Vincent Gallo and Brown Bunny. Both of those, the interesting thing is not that all three filmmakers used real people instead of actors in some of their movies, if not several of their movies. It's also the fact that when you have John Cassavetes and Vincent Gallo, they were pretty much aiming for realism, whether intentionally
Yes.
or unintentionally. The pacing, the way the movies played out, the way the dialogue played out, the way the scenes played out, um, it was always a sense of this is real. This isn't Hollywood. This isn't glitz and glam. This is what real people do look like a lot of scenes it didn't even look like was any of the actors ever had makeup, and forget scenes in full movies. They just look like they just, got up and started shooting, no hair, wardrobe, makeup, anything. Um, and the thing with Dreyer is he had the opposite approach in that his philosophy was he wanted to get as far away from uh, the constraints of reality. He was all about being surreal, being about expression, emotion, trying to go as far away from the camera as he possibly could. And what they were aiming for in the end result was very different. But in their approach, the tools they were using were very similar in that they said, hey, I have this approach that's going right. I have this approach that's going left. But you know what? We're both going to use the same tools. We're both going to use real people to accomplish our goals. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I was going to say the last thing I would describe this film as is realism. I don't see this as a very realistic movie, much more surreal. It's tempting to think of it in the context of the German Expressionist films, because so many of those early silent horror films were German Expressionism. But this isn't that, though. This isn't really German Expressionism. It's something else. It's got its own kind of surrealistic style going on, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing too is another filmmaker I'll also mention, since I mentioned Cassavetes and Vincent Gallo, is Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who was a filmmaker who we also covered for All About Eve, and he was very much keep the camera fucking still. Don't move the goddamn camera. Give me my 2-shot, give me my 3-shot, just give me my basic shots. Let the actors and let the script and let the dialogue take control. All right. None of your fancy smanchy bullshit. Great filmmaker, did some great films. And you have this guy who's the exact opposite, who's like, you know what? Let's do as much as possible with the camera. Let's just throw everything at it. Let's just do everything possible to avoid basic shots, And I find that incredibly interesting that you can have two filmmakers both make great films, both be top 100 films. I think Passion of Joan of Arc is considered one of the greatest films ever made, as well as All About Eve, and we've covered them both, and I love them both. And you can have these two people who philosophically are like oil and water, as far as like how they want to shoot a film. And it's not just that they're opposites, but the end result is also the opposite in that, Mankiewicz, what did we say was the only flaw in All About Eve? Just the visual aspect, but the dialogue, the script, everything everything else was just top notch, perfect. And then the only flaw I found in Vampyr, we're going to talk about it later in our 3-hour review that you're going to take over, is the only flaw I found in the movie is like the story. It's like you didn't engage me in a story, but like visually, some of the things he was doing was just so amazing. I'm like taking notes. I'm stealing this, I'm stealing that. I'm doing all the things like when I do my next film, I'm like looking at all these things that I want to just incorporate in my own movies when I'm watching this thing. It's just a bombardment of like all these great things that you're seeing visually. But with the story, there's just like there's no substance to it. It's all style, but very little substance. So I just found that interesting as well.
Yeah, and that was exactly my feeling too, is that it's a beautiful movie to look at. There's a lot of really interesting shots. There's interesting moments. Story-wise, yeah, this isn't really a movie to watch for story. It's not going to make a lot of sense to you. It's very cryptic. It's a very cryptic story, whatever story there is there. And I think if you watch it more than once, you'll start to understand it a little better, but it's not going to be satisfying in terms of telling you a story. Interestingly enough, it's based on the writing of Sheridan Le Fanu, and he's most famous for his lesbian vampire story Carmilla, which this is one of the things that's supposedly based on. although they claim it's based on several stories that he wrote that were included in one collection, I believe. But I think primarily Carmilla is the one that it's based on. And that was very influential. It influenced Bram Stoker when he made Dracula. And there's been a whole lot of movies made based on Carmilla. There have been plays. I actually have a friend who's been writing a play adaptation of Carmilla for years. So yeah, it's really adapted a lot. And I think this might be the very first time that somebody tried to adapt it and make a film out of it. They did not include any of the lesbian aspect, though, which is interesting. They got rid of that. But you know, it's based on stories that actually are interesting and that people like to read, but it's not really, the end result of it is not really a story in the same way, I don't think, as if you were to read the original stories.
Another filmmaker I compare him to is Stanley Kubrick, in the sense that when Kubrick did his one horror movie in The Shining, he thought he was like, hey, I'm going to make a commercial movie. I'm going to make a movie that everyone's going to want to watch. He only forgot that he's Stanley Kubrick, and you know, no, he's never going to get a wide audience because he's Stanley Kubrick. He's going to do some far out shit that's going to get him a cult following, but he's not he's not a filmmaker where like this is for the masses. He always thought of himself as commercial, because I think he even thought Eyes Wide Shut would be a commercial movie. That's why he got Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, but not a commercial director. The great director, my favorite director, but he always fooled himself in thinking he'd have commercial success. But he did The Shining because he wanted to do a commercial film. I'm gonna do this, you know, this Stephen King movie. It's gonna have Jack Nicholson. It's gonna be huge, yeah. And it wasn't, but it's considered one of the my favorite all-time horror movie. And I think the same thing happened with Dreyer. He had a financial bomb with The Passion of Joan of Arc, now looked at as one of the greatest films ever made, at least one of the greatest silence, you know, films ever made. And he thought, hey, vampires are big, and they were big in the late 20s into the 30s, and everybody wanted to do a vampire movie. Dracula was huge, and vampires were the thing in pop culture, and he wanted to do his version as well. And they both had the same approach, but they both made films that today are looked at as like historically great, but neither were huge financial successes.
Yeah, that's true. Dracula, the book, had come out, and there was a play adaptation in 1927 that was hugely popular. I think that Dreyer started working on this movie before the movie Dracula came out, so I don't think he was influenced by it per se, but there are similarities. You can see some parallels there, and you know, it could be that they were both very influenced by Sheridan Le Fanu, Carmilla. But yeah, it was definitely something in the air. Vampires were, I think he even made a comment that they're trendy or they're popular or something like that. And yeah, he kind of said, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. But it turned out he couldn't quite do it in the same way that other people had done it. It didn't quite appeal to the audience in the way that, say, Dracula did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder why. You look at this movie, it's like, I love it, but I mean, come on, you know, it's like, what's going on here? Like, you know, like, why is the main character not involved in like defeating any of the villains? It's a very odd story, yes. As visually dynamic as it is.
It is. And actually, Dracula, you know, you could say, like, for a Todd Browning movie, it's one of his less visually interesting movies. And he was a silent director as well, who made Dracula sound film. And some people complain that it's kind of boring. You know, they don't see a lot of interesting shots in there. So in a way, he's telling the story. You know, he's just telling the story. And that's what's working. Whereas this movie, he's not so much just telling the story, he's doing all kinds of things. It's again, the polar opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last thing I'll say about this film is it's interesting that what you hear about this film is that some people found it silly and they laughed at it. And some people found it scary. And it in the UK, it got the first film to receive an H for horrific. So it, you know, it's kind of like a rating system, you know, where younger kids can't see it. I don't know if it'd be equivalent of R, or at least maybe a PG-13. And there were scenes that needed to be edited down or edited out. like they're putting the stake in the into the corpse of the vampire to keep it on the earth. They had to cut that short because it was too horrific. And the end scene where the guy's being covered in the powder, they had to be cut that short because it was too horrific. But still, people were laughing at points where they were supposed to be scared. And I think that's a symptom of the genre in itself, in that my favorite, one of my favorite genres or subgenre would be slasher films, which is right up there with noirs as far as like the subgenre I could just pop in and just watch. I could watch it in the middle of the movie, the end of it. I just love watching them. It could be any movie in that category. I would just watch it. But with slasher films, they're intended to be scary, but I laugh just as much as I find it scary. I probably laugh more than I'm scared watching it. And I think even serious horror movies like Paranormal Activity, your favorite film, I find that hilarious at times. I find it stupid, but I don't find it scary. And that's a hugely successful film. I mean, I know you bought the Blu-ray and, a huge collection of it, but there are people that, that find even successful or great horror movies to be silly. And I think it's a symptom of the genre. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely true. There is a fine line between humor and horror, and they do seem to go well together. Some of my favorite films are essentially funny horror films, spoofy
But
horror
in
films.
terms of unintentional, though, I guess is my point.
Yeah, well, that's true too. And I mean, we talked about The Haunting, which is one of the great haunted house films of all time, but it's also unintentionally funny at times, right? Unintentionally hilarious at times, but it's still scary and effective, and it still works as a serious ghost story, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of ups and downs with this film. It wasn't successful. Even at the time, I don't think he was even successful critically, much less commercially. It lost a lot of money. He didn't do another film for years, Carl Dreyer. And today it's
That's
looked
true.
at as great. I don't know what that's doing for him. He's been dead for a long time now. Maybe it
That's
helps his
true.
legacy, but I don't know
Yeah.
what much it did for him. Uh, but and people didn't like it. They laughed
Hmm.
when they should have been scared. He edited it down because some of the scenes even he didn't think was worth keeping in the film. When he had his final cut, he could have kept those scenes in. He could have said, "Screw you guys, I'm going to keep these scenes in there. I think they're great." So even he
Hmm.
questioned some of what he did, but the end result is something that is greatly influential. And like I said, I'm looking at this, I'm taking notes because I'm like, holy crap, like I need to do some of this stuff. And there are two filmmakers in particular that I know I brought up a lot of filmmakers comparing them to, but there are a couple of filmmakers that just sing his praises. Guillermo del Toro, who did an audio commentary track for the film, and also David Lynch, who talked glowingly about him. And the first time I watched this film, I barely remember my first viewing of it, but I did know I watched it at least once. I didn't really see any connection there because I didn't think of it. But I did some research before I watched it here because I know we're doing it for the show. And then I read how big of a fan David Lynch was. As I'm watching this, I'm like, this is not scary. So it reminded me of, I don't know if you heard of the film Mother. It starred Jennifer Lawrence, and it was I forgot the
I
name of
think
the
so.
director.
I
Yeah.
think so.
Can you just Google the name of the director for me so I don't have to like research later and put it on the screen? But Mother was a film that was advertised as a horror film, but it was really an art house film. So it made a lot of money because Jennifer Lawrence was in it, and it was a horror film. It was advertised as with the trailer. So the first weekend it made a lot of money, then it didn't make anything. And actually people hated it because they were promised one thing and they got another, which kind of reminds me of this in that this was probably pushed as a horror film. But if you were going into this thinking you're getting like a vampire movie and this is what you got, I could see why people would be pissed off. You go into this thinking you're going to get Dracula and you get this low budget art house film that has no real story. you know, you can see why it would peeve people off. Um, so yeah, I definitely found that part of it interesting. What was the name of the director?
Darren Aronofsky.
Darren Aronofsky. Yeah, definitely a guy we should cover on this as
Yes.
well. But
Yes.
yeah, you know, you set certain expectations and then you turn those expectations and you subvert them. That can be another reason why it's not popular amongst critics or fans, because they were pitched one thing and they got another. Um, but I mean, maybe if it was more true in its advertising or its goals, then maybe it wouldn't have had such an icy reception. You know, you go in expecting something that's going to be scary and thrills, and this is what you get instead, like artsy fartsy. It's gonna be like, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for here. You know, so I can
Yeah,
definitely understand that aspect of it. Expectations has a lot to do with how people end up viewing something.
for sure. And you know, I even find that for myself when I watch a movie. You know, the first time I may hate it, you know, and then I'll watch it again and I'll be expecting to hate it. I'll be expecting it to be terrible, but it will surprise me that it's a lot better than I thought. Or the opposite might happen where I'll love it and then my expectations are so high that when I watch it the second time, I'm like, why did I like this the first time? This doesn't seem as good. So, yeah, expectations definitely play a big part in it. And I know that Dreyer, he was a journalist, I guess, before he became a filmmaker. And he kind of went back to journalism for about 10 years after this film. I don't know if it's because of the failure of the film or the critical response, or, you know, I'm not sure, but it's interesting that he disappeared for about 10 years from filmmaking before finally getting back to it.
Mm-hmm. And to bring this back to David Lynch, I defy you to watch a David Lynch film, have a David Lynch, any David Lynch film, be the next film you see after you see this film, because the parallels are just unbelievable. Because when you watch a David Lynch film, it's the same emotions you get from watching this film. It's like visually stunning, confusing, bewilderment. It's like, what's going on? Wait, what? But you're fascinated, but it's just so odd. You know, it's artistic, it's incredible, but it's just so odd. And the emotions I got from this, I'm like, this is so much like a David Lynch movie. So I could see like how he got direct inspiration from his style from doing a movie like this, where it's just like, all right, I'll come up with somewhat of a structure, but I'm more concerned about doing individually interesting stuff that evokes emotion and with a thin thread that's keeping this whole thing together. But from scene to scene, it's going to be, you know, art, you know. So,
Yeah, and I can totally see that. David Lynch, yeah, now that you mention it, I've had similar feelings watching some of his films. You know, what the hell is going on here? What is this character doing? I don't understand this moment. You know, and it's all about the weird little moments as opposed to the through line. You know, there isn't always a clear story. It's just like, oh, this is an interesting moment. This is an interesting visual thing. Let's just sit on this for a few minutes. You know, so yeah, I can totally see how this film would be a huge influence to him.
okay, we could end it here.
Okay.
I'll call you back in 10 for your part, unless you want to touch base on anything else before we wrap.
No, I think that should be good.
Okay, knowing that your part is going to take really long and I still have 9 minutes to go here, maybe we can decide on something for next week. So I did like when we talked about when you said you want to do the what's that movie you want to do, the
The
Lighthouse?
Lighthouse, yeah.
Yeah. So at the time we agreed to that, I didn't watch this, but having watched this, to go from this to the Lighthouse feels
Yeah.
too similar. Do you get what I'm
Oh yeah.
saying? It's
Yeah, yeah.
really artsy, black and white, kind of like where's the story here? It's just about visuals. Maybe something a little
Yeah.
bit different, you know, instead of
Okay.
doing
Yeah.
like back to back with these type of movies.
Sure.
I'm thinking
Yeah.
maybe we should do something maybe in color at least, instead of
Okay.
something super old.
Yeah.
Um, so I know like so a couple movies that came to mind. Saw 10 came out recently. We
Oh
could
yes.
possibly revisit Saw 1.
Yeah.
I know the anniversary edition of The Exorcist was re-released in theaters recently. We could potentially do The Exorcist.
Yes.
I was thinking maybe something indie, or something small, like
Yeah.
it was some like cheesy little movie I thought would have been interesting. Now I can't really even think of it. I should have wrote it down.
Oh,
But yeah,
fairly
any thoughts
recent.
from yours, from just any thoughts you have?
Uh, well, when you said color, I just thought of, is it called Mystery of the Wax Museum, which is like 1932. It's an old movie, but it's one of the
Mhm.
first movies shot in color. So
Yeah.
that popped
Well,
into
I
my
guess I
head.
was thinking more
But
so something more contemporary than that.
yeah, yeah,
Because we've been doing
exactly.
a little older films for a while now, right?
That's true. Yes. Um,
Is there any contemporary horror film that's worth examining?
well, I'm sure there must be. Yeah, I always draw a blank when I try to think of these things.
Is there a
Um,
great filmmaker that recently dabbled in horror?
hmm, good question.
Because the
Oh,
most
let's see.
recent horror film we talked about was The Conjuring, right?
That's true. Yes.
Mhm.
Um,
Any recent great filmmaker dabbled in horror that would fit the format of what we're doing?
yeah.
Maybe I should go on Google or something.
Um, this isn't quite the same thing, but Ty West has made a lot of good horror films. He's one of the current guys. And I
Mhm.
know people are really excited about these movies. I haven't seen them yet, but X, he
Mhm.
made a movie called X, and then I think he made a couple of sequels to that.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd rather watch it independently first before I commit to do it for a show. Because I heard they're
for
like
sure.
really super like body horror gore, and that's not my
Oh yeah,
favorite of, like the super like gory stuff is not necessarily at the top of my list to do. I'm just
right.
not fans of that. I prefer more like story and stuff like that than like body
Fair
horror.
enough. Yeah.
I don't know, are you fans of that stuff? I mean, if you are, maybe I'll give it a shot.
Well, it depends.
Mhm.
Uh, um,
What
well,
about
I mean,
this
David
isn't
Cronenberg is one of my favorites.
Cronenberg. Maybe I guess. I mean, I guess the only body horror film I probably like is maybe The Fly.
Oh yeah, that's a great movie.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm. Oh, I know what the cheesy movie I was thinking about doing was Halloween 3.
oh yes,
That is
yes,
super
I love that
cheesy.
movie.
That is
That's one of my
cheese
favorites
on
of
top
all.
of cheese.
Yeah,
And it is
going way back
Halloween.
to when I was young. It
Yeah,
is, yeah,
it is
totally,
Halloween
yeah,
that we're celebrating.
it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a
So
bad idea.
I mean, it's pretty. I mean, it wouldn't take much research. I mean, it's pretty like, I don't know how in depth we could go on that one. We could do it though if you wanted.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do like it a lot. I
Mhm.
would be into that.
All right, let's think about it, and we'll
Sure.
come back to it at the end of the other one. All right,
Okay.
all right.
Sure.
I'll call you in 10. All right,
Okay. Sounds good. Whoa.
all set?
I'm all set.
Okay, just real quick before we get started, just a warning to all viewers, if you have loved ones, kids, a significant other, you may want to pause this and say something to them now. Tell them how much you love them because you never can tell when you're going to see them again. This podcast may last several days, weeks, months, years. You never know with Angus. So tell them how much you love them because you never know when you're ever going to see them again. All right. I trust that you viewers have unpaused and go ahead, Angus, take it away.
Okay. Vampyr. The movie starts with a title card. This is the tale of the strange adventures of the young Allan Gray, who immersed himself in the study of devil worship and vampires, Preoccupied with superstitions of centuries past, he became a dreamer for whom the line between the real and the supernatural became blurred. His aimless wanderings led him late one evening to a secluded inn by the river in a village called Courtempierre. So this is interesting to me that they start this movie with this title card, because it makes it seem like the character's already been studying vampires and devil worship, and he's already into this stuff. But I'm not sure if that's really what they intend, because it seems like he kind of discovers that as the movie goes on. But I don't know. We could talk about that. We could wait until a bit later to see how that pans out. Did you have any immediate thought about that?
Of course. So the one flaw I notice when watching this film is the story. And when I'm watching this, I'm thinking, what does this remind me of? What have I seen a better version story-wise? I'm not talking about the visuals. The visuals are amazing. Story-wise, what did this remind me of, and where did I see this done better? And the thing that consistently popped up in my head was the Hammer films. Those Hammer films, especially those vampire films, what did you have? You had some person who was an outsider. They'd come to a lodge or an inn, or they'd be going for like drinks or food or someplace to sleep, and he was like, "What brings you into town, stranger?" And they'd be like, "Well, I'm going to that castle, or and I have to settle this estate or see this person or just do something." And then suddenly silence, and they'd be like, "Oh, rumbles," and like, "Oh, you don't want to be going to something like that," where it built up, because once the craziness starts, it's amazing, but there's no build to that craziness, and I just wish there was a little bit more build. Like, even what you read, that could have been showed visually. It could have been he's in his office and he's doing all these books and doing all this, and then his wife is knocking. He's like, "Oh no, get away from me!" And that could have established that he's really into this stuff, rather than just he's there and then it starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, if he's already into it, it seems like a pretty big coincidence in terms of all the stuff that happens from here. But maybe we'll comment more on that as it goes along. So we have a man named Allan Gray, and he rents a room at an inn. And during the night, he wakes to a knock on his door, and the key inside the door mysteriously turns in the lock, and the door opens, and an old man enters the room. And Allan says, "Who are you?" And the old man says, "She must die. You understand?" Of course, if it was me, I would say, "No, I don't. Please explain." But he doesn't say that. So the old man sets a square package on a table, and he writes on it, "To be opened upon my death." And then the old man nods and he leaves the room. And Allan gets up and he examines the package thoughtfully. I don't know, if I had a dime for every time this happened to me, I mean, this is just like an old man shows up in your room and says, "She must die, you understand?" and then leaves a package to be opened upon his death. I mean, they don't even know each other. Like, it's a very strange and intriguing beginning. And it certainly made me want to know what's going on here. This is a weird opening. Did you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I thought it was that "Don't let her die" or something like that. It was "She must die."
That's that's what the subtitle said. Yeah.
Okay, I must have misread that. I thought it was like "Don't let her die" or something. But so very Lynchian in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It, I don't know how many different Lynch movies have had some kind of weird setup like that, where it's just like, "Wait, what? What the hell am I watching? What's going on? Who's that guy? What?"
Yeah.
So it very Lynchian from that standpoint. So I could see, like, David Lynch is a huge fan of this film, and Carl Dreyer. So you definitely see that there in this particular scene. And again, as I previously said in the first section of the film he talked about, I just wish before this happened, there was some kind of buildup before the weirdness started. You don't know anything about this lead character that we're about to be following
No.
before the weird stuff starts happening to him. And I just wish you gave me some reason to invest in him, or if there was more to his journey that we knew about,
Yes. I agree. And we get another title card at this point, which says, "What was going on? What terrifying secret was unfolding? Allan Gray felt certain of one thing: a soul in mortal distress was crying out for help, and a voice within him urged him to heed that call." So yeah, I mean, I guess so. I have to agree. What the hell is going on here? So Allan leaves the hotel, and in a very surrealistic sequence, he seems to be following shadows that just kind of exist on their own. There's no person, there's just a shadow. And although there is one really cool moment, I think, where a shadow sits down on a bench next to a soldier, and they look quite alike, and eventually they get up in unison, and they move identically, but they go in opposite directions. So I suppose that this is the soldier's shadow, but it is somehow separating itself from him. So visually, very, very interesting, and an interesting idea that these shadows are kind of existing on their own. So eventually, after entering an old decrepit castle, Allan meets another old man, and this one looks a bit like Albert Einstein to me. He's got a mustache, glasses, wild hair, and he seems to be looking for something. And then a door opens and an old woman with a cane enters, and the man helps guide her to a place to sit down, and she hands him what looks like a small bottle of poison. Next thing we see, Allan is wandering outside. We don't really see what happened when he left or how he got away from them or whatever, but he's now wandering outside and he's following the shadows again. Any thoughts on this shadow sequence?
It was an assault on the eyes and the mind. It was amazing. I loved it. The movie had me hooked at this point. The only thing it's missing, again, I'll keep repeating it, is context. Like, give me something, give me something.
Yes.
But how can you not be impressed by some of the scenes we saw? The guy shoveling backwards, all the shadow stuff you talked about. I'm not sure. In this section, did we get him walking through the house yet, or is that further down in a little next section?
Just the decrepit castle. We're about to get to the house.
Okay, then I'll save my comments for that section then. But yeah.
Okay.
Amazing so far.
Yeah, very, very visually interesting, and yeah. But again, where is he going? Why is he going? How does he know to follow these shadows? It's all very cryptic. So there's another title card which says that he's come to an estate where the original old man who appeared to him in the room at the inn lives with his two daughters. And so Allan watches through a window and he sees the old man, and then he sees a shadow pointing a gun, which in fact could well be the shadow we just saw on the bench with the soldier. And a shot rings out and the old man falls to the floor. A servant lets Allan in and they rush to the old man's aid, but he ultimately dies with one of his daughters by his side. And then one of the servants asks Allan to stay with them. And then he leaves Allan alone with the daughter, Giselle. They look out the window. They see a carriage leaving. It's going to the police. Allan pulls the package out of his pocket and he opens it because, of course, now the old man had died. So the package is opened upon his death. And the title of the book seems to be The Strange History of Vampires. Any thoughts at this point?
A lot. So this section includes him walking through the house?
I think so, yeah.
With all the skulls and all that stuff? I know that was early in the film. I think you probably covered it at this point, right?
I think so.
Yeah. I think you must have. It was either in the previous section or this section. But there's a part where he's walking through the house and we're seeing all these skulls and all these different cobwebs and all these different things. And it was just like, oh my God, this is like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like when, they get into that house with all the cannibals. Like, this is so creepy and so awesome. I just love that whole sequence because you're seeing all this weird crap. Before it was just the visual camera work and the cinematography, but now there were the props and the decor and just the whole atmosphere was just great. So I loved it again. It already had me, but I just love that whole sequence. It just, the first thing that pops in my head was Texas Chainsaw. Uh, Context again. Let's say the old man, right, was like his father.
Yeah.
It's like, give me something that would make me care about this old guy, because then it'd be
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, like he came here to see his father. His father acted weird, walked in his room, did some weird stuff. All right, we're gonna get something more going. Then his father dies. It's like, give me something like the characters like care, or there's some kind of connection. Some random old dude that walked into his room is now dead. Like, there's no emotional connection for me in that in any way. Even for the character, there's no emotional connection.
Yeah.
And it's like one of the
Yeah.
only deaths we see until the end sequencer, so
Hmm.
not a lot as far as like action going on. And then when we do get action, it's not someone that we necessarily care about or even know.
Yeah.
The other comments I would have is, I keep comparing this to other things just because it's such an old movie that I know not a lot of people are familiar with. So I just try to compare it to contemporary things just so people can get some context. But another more contemporary film, not that new, is Sleepy Hollow, the Johnny Depp version with Tim Burton. I'm not sure if you
Hmm.
saw that, but I loved Johnny Depp's performance in that, because generally a hero of a film is a little bit stoic, and sometimes they get a little scared sometimes. Generally in horror movies, you don't really get a lot of male protagonists because you want to see the protagonist freak out. And it's like more
Hmm.
comfortable for people to watch a woman freaking out than a guy. So two things I thought: one, this probably should have had a female protagonist, and two, if it had a male protagonist, I wish they would have played it more like Johnny Depp in that movie, because something creepy would happen and your expectation would be like Johnny Depp would just take it in. And I remember there was this hard
Hmm.
cut and Johnny Depp is like hiding behind his sheet, like curled up like a little baby, scared, like, I want to go home, type reaction. And
Yeah.
it's even something like that would have been great if he would have freaked out more, because there's all these freaky things going on, but if the characters aren't reacting over the top, then how can we emotionally invest in what's going on? It's like, I'm more creeped out about what's going on than the lead character is creeped out. And it's some creepy shit. So
Hmm.
that's another thought. Like, maybe if the lead character would have been like more jarred by all the jarring stuff that's going on. But then when you read about it, the lead character is actually not an actor. He's the one that helped finance the film, and his one
Yes.
request was that he wanted to star in it.
Yeah. He's another one. This was his only film, I believe. His first and last film as an actor. Um, yeah. And, he starts to read about vampires here in this book. He's unwrapped this book. Here's the history of vampires. But the title card of the movie led us to believe that he was already kind of into that and already an expert. So, what does this book really bring to him if that's the case? Unless that title card is summarizing the movie that we're about to watch, which is the only other possibility I can think of. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I'm a bit confused by that. But as Alan reads about the vampires, elsewhere in the house, Giselle's sister, Leon, she disappears from her bed. And Giselle spots her wandering around outside the house, and she calls Alan over, and they rush outside, and they see the old woman with the cane that he had seen in the castle, and she's bent over the unmoving body of Leon. But the old woman kind of leaves before they can get there. So they carry her back into the house and they attend to a wound on her neck. And she seems upset and she says, "If only I could die. I know I'm lost. I'm damned." And then sometime later, the carriage that had gone for the police returns and the driver collapses. And Alan sees blood dripping onto the ground below. He continues reading the book, and he learns that there was a village doctor in Hungary who sold his soul and became a vampire's henchman. And almost on cue, a doctor arrives at the house to see Leon, and it is in fact the old man from the castle who looks like Einstein. So I'm starting to put things together here as to who these characters might be. The doctor examines Leon, and she is doing poorly. Allan asks if she can be saved. The doctor says perhaps, but she needs blood. And he asks Allan if he's willing to give his own. He then prepares to draw Allan's blood. Giselle asks, why does this doctor only come at night? And the older servant starts to read Allan's book and learns about how to destroy vampires, as well as about a vampire that is in the form of an old woman. So any thoughts about any of this stuff?
Yeah, so this was a section where they ran out in the forest and grabbed her and brought her back into the house, right? Before the doctor
Yes.
came. So
Yes.
it's a minor gripe, because I've had it with other films before, including Night of the Living Dead, is the day for night stuff. It's obviously daytime. And they walk out there with those lanterns. I'm like, what is that lantern doing for you? The sun is like beaming down on you guys. Like, I know it's black and white. I know you're trying to cover it up, but it's clear, like, it's so bright out there, and they're holding these lanterns as if that's doing something for them. So I found that hilarious. And when she had that line, like, he only comes at night, he's standing by, I don't know if it was like a window or a door, but he's standing there, and the sun is like beaming down on him. I'm like, what are you talking about? He only comes at night. You're not fooling anyone, movie. But that's a gripe I have with a lot of movies, not specifically this. But yeah, you kind of get like an antagonist with this guy. You know, you get the henchman line just as he walks in the door. So it's pretty obvious, like, all right, this guy's not so good, this guy.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I mean, this book is already sort of shaping up to be amazing, because it's told us about a doctor that's suspicious, and then a doctor shows up. It's also mentioned an old woman who's a vampire, and hey, we've seen an old woman a couple of times now. So it's almost like this book was written for this specific situation. So it's really quite amazing.
Maybe it's a script and not a book.
Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it is. And I find this is kind of an interesting point where the older servant now starts to read the book. And this is kind of where our hero, Allan, you know, if we had any doubts about him, this is where they really start to come true, because it's almost like the older servant takes over the job that he should be doing. The older servant is continuing to learn about vampires and actually how to destroy them, while Allan is apparently giving blood to this suspicious doctor so that he can try to save Leon. And so after he's done that, he's very weak, and he's sort of helped to a chair where he falls asleep. And he wakes up at one point and complains that he's losing his blood, and the doctor kind of dismisses his concerns. And I guess the book is sort of talking about an iron stake. You need an iron stake through the heart in order to kill a vampire, and nailing the old woman to the earth. And when you do this, the curse is broken. And it also talks about this vampire epidemic from 25 years ago in the very town where we are, Courtempierre. The book even names the suspected vampire, Marguerite Chopin, who lies buried in the village cemetery. So this book is awesome. It's not only telling us everything we need, it's like, we know who the vampire is, and she's buried over there in this cemetery. Like, whoever wrote this book could have really just taken care of this problem, it seems to me, but instead they wrote a book and left it for somebody else. Do you have any thoughts about this part?
No, you get a lot of exposition here, I guess. Storytelling done throughout the book. I did like that it was done throughout the book, as opposed to, I guess, other routes they could have gone. But I wish it would have been told in a more of like part of the story type of a way, you know, where it unfolded and we could see it as opposed to reading it. I did like the book versus maybe cue cards, you know, that you would see in the silent films. I don't know what you would call those screen cards in the silent films. but I
Yeah.
prefer it coming from a book as opposed to text on the screen, where characters are just going back and forth. Because you do have a lot of scenes like this in movies. In the
Yeah.
80s, they would have found these type of books in like a library. There'd be a scene where they're
Hmm.
researching in the library about
Yes.
demons or about vampires, and like, oh my God, look at this, you know. And then you have eventually like the Necronomicon became a thing with the Evil Dead movies, and nowadays they'd be like searching on Google online or something. So you do have scenes like these traditionally
Yes.
in horror movies where it's like, all right, it's time for us to find out the truth about this monster and how to defeat it, who it is, what it is, and kind of giving the information to the audience. So it is kind of familiar, this type of sequence. I like I said, I liked it coming from a book as opposed to from this just characters talking in silent bubbles. But I prefer if they could have
Hmm.
told it in a story.
Yeah, and I think often there would be a character, like possibly a Van Helsing type of character, who would show up and tell people. He would kind of bring the knowledge to them. But in this case, we have the book, and you're right. It's kind of like the earliest, possibly the earliest example of that. Let's go research this and let's find out what's going on. But it's just so darn convenient that this one book, which
Yeah.
happened to be given to him randomly, happens to have all the answers that they need.
It
But
could have been him like an old man, like the old guy in Pet Cemetery, or like the old
yeah,
guy in like Friday the 13th, where you campers don't go up there, you know. It could have been something like that
yes,
too.
yes, absolutely, yes. Um, so moving forward, Alan seems to have a nightmare involving a skeleton holding a bottle of poison. And then he's woken up by the older servant and told to come quickly. Something terrible is happening. And we see Leon pick up the bottle of poison, perhaps intending to drink it. And then the doctor and Alan arrive in the room and they get into a scuffle. And Alan rushes to Leon, and I'm not sure if she's drunk the poison. It's a little bit unclear. I think she probably has. The doctor vanishes, and then Alan attempts to follow, perhaps getting some help from the shadows again. And the older servant tells the nun that Leon must die, but she must live until sunrise. And then he leaves the house with tools. And I initially I wondered if this is what the original comment of the old man when he says she must die. You understand? I wondered if he was talking about his daughter because he knew she was infected by whatever this is, but that may not be what he's referring to. So then we come to perhaps one of the most interesting parts of the movie where Alan is exhausted and he sits on a bench and then he seems to have an out-of-body experience. His spirit, I guess, kind of continues on the journey. It splits apart. He splits in two and he finds a coffin, and when he pulls back the sheet, it appears to be Alan himself lying inside the coffin. Any thoughts about this?
So you kind of stopped at a weird point because I did want to talk about him splitting, but you only talked about
Yes,
the start of him splitting, and there's a whole sequence with the split Alan. So,
it's
uh,
true.
yeah.
Shall
So
I?
yeah,
I can.
continue till the split's done
Yeah.
because I wanted to talk about that.
Okay. All right. So he sees Giselle tied up in another room. He tries to open the door, but he can't. And I was wondering if it was because he's a spirit. But it turns out, I think the doctor shows up and Alan watches him and he sees where the key is hidden. So he didn't have the key to open the door. And then another man shows up and they attach a lid to the coffin. And I think this is one of the most interesting shots sequences in the movie where we kind of see Alan's point of view from inside the coffin looking up through the window, and he's watching the lid being attached and he's watching a candle being lit. And I'm wondering, is he actually inside the coffin now, or is his spirit still outside somewhere watching it? I'm not sure. And then the doctor orders three shadowy figures to go, and they carry the coffin outside and across the countryside, and we experience Allan's point of view from inside as he passes buildings and trees and things. And it's very effective and it's very creepy. And it, of course, is suggesting the whole buried alive scenario, which we've come to know in other movies where he's being carried and we're thinking, oh no, they're carrying him to the graveyard to bury him, I presume. And that's a pretty horrifying thought. And they wander past Allan's other spirit half, which is still sitting on the bench. And then after, they sort of seem to dissolve into the air, and then Allan becomes whole again and awakens on the bench. So that's kind of the end of that sequence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for wrapping that sequence up for me. So I was confused as fuck during this whole thing. So he splits off when he sits on the bench, right? I don't know if it's like
yes,
he's sleeping, because so it looks like he just nods off to the side, and then the spirit self comes up. So it looks like he's sleeping or dreaming or meditating, but he's not conscious, but he's solid. Yes. The version that comes out is transparent. So we have his actual body, who's just like a corpse right now, or unconscious. And we have his spirit self, or his ghost self, or whatever, walking around. It has to be, because that's a transparent version. So you're thinking no one can see him, right? But if no one can see him and he hears them, why is he hiding? Because he goes to hide down and like, why are you hiding if you're transparent? Aren't you like the spirit version? If you're the real version, why are you transparent? And what's the other version that's sitting down on the bench then, if you're the real version? And then he goes and hides, and after he hides, there's another version in the coffin. So it's like, wait a minute. Is this like the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? Like, what the hell is going on here? So you got your body, your spirit, and then your corpse. And then the corpse doesn't move. But how do we get to the corpse? We no longer have his point of view, because prior to him hiding, it was all his point of view. But once he hides and he's gone, it's no longer his point of view. Then we're just seeing the scene play out. Then, like, whose perspective are we seeing now? But then it does switch to his point of view as the corpse. But the corpse is a corpse. It never moves. It doesn't do anything. I did kudos to him for good acting, because the actor does have like these really big eyes. And it works really well in this scene that his eyes could have went lazy and just had him close his eyes for the death scene, but he had his eyes open and he wasn't blinking at all. And I was thinking, man, if this was like an Andy Milligan movie, he would have been blinking, coughing, scratching his face, because Andy Milligan loves his moving corpses. But yeah, I'm just thinking like whose perspective am I getting here? Because it's no longer his perspective. And then we do get some really cool shots though from inside the coffin, and then you do occasionally get the dead Allan's perspective. Visually, this was just amazing. Just a different perspective with the shots, the angles, the three versions of him. I just thought, like, filmmaking wise, this is great. But like storyline, I was like, what the fuck is going on? Like, I'm so confused right now. Like, who is who right now? And then when the corpse goes past the sleeping or meditating or dead on the bench Allan, then he wakes up. Then I'm like, wait a minute, like, why are you up now? You know, it's like your corpse just passed, and it was just weird. It was weird, man. It's some weird shit, man.
Yes.
So
it is. Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure how we go into the body in the coffin. That's the part that's very weird. Like, you got the spirit watching, but then it's almost like, is the spirit sucked into the body somehow? Is he now trapped in the body? And how
last we saw the spirit went hiding in like the basement or something.
Yeah, I know. And it's, you know, we know there's a body out on the bench somewhere. So where's this body come from? So I'm not sure whether this is it part of a nightmare? Is it part of just a strange vision? I don't quite understand it, but yeah, I found it all very visually very interesting and very effective in that sort of creepy kind of dread kind of way, where, oh no, he's inside the coffin and he's going to be buried. So yeah, I didn't understand it exactly, but I found it really cool to look at. So after they dissolve and he wakes up on the bench, he sees the old servant walking into the graveyard with his tools. So Allan follows, and Allan watches the servant open a grave, and then he goes to help him, and they open the coffin and they find the old woman inside. And the servant thrusts an iron stake through her. We hear hammering, and the woman's face turns into a skull. Back at the house, Leon sits up in bed. She looks happy and she says, "I feel strong. My soul is free." Then there's some thunder and lightning, and we see the giant face of Leon's father appear at the doctor's window. And the doctor's frightened, and we see Allan going to get the key from its hiding place. And he frees Giselle. And then the two of them make a getaway while the doctor's hurrying, and he runs into an old mill where he kind of gets trapped into a cage-like area. And the old servant shows up there, and he starts some gears turning, at least I assume he does. And Allan and Giselle get in a boat, and they drift into the fog as the doctor is slowly buried under flour. And then Allan and Giselle arrive in a brighter place just as the doctor is completely engulfed and he dies. So what we've got here, I think, is a happy ending. In spite of what they had said earlier about she must die, and saying that Leon must die, it seems to me that she's cured here. She doesn't die. And I almost wondered for a second if the nun was going to mistakenly kill her because he had told her to wait until sunrise and then kill her. But I don't think so. I think she just is cured, and it seems like a happy ending for her. And again, I think that the servant is really the one who does all of this. He does all of, he brings the tools, he goes to the grave, he opens it, he thrusts the spike through the grave. Our hero, Allan, is really just observing. He's not really responsible for any of this stuff. So not really as much of a hero as maybe that servant is. But anyway, what are your thoughts about this section?
I also was baffled by the fact that the hero wasn't involved in anything heroic. Yes. It was kind of weird. It's like he wasn't involved in defeating anyone. And I guess you remember that was the father. I didn't know who that disembodied head was. I'm what's that disembodied head doing floating there? Like, who is that? Like, why is he there? And you saw that everyone, they start turning on each other, and then he eventually dies from all that, that powder stuff. And again, our hero's not involved in any of it. And when did he fall in love with that other girl that they're like boating? And who were they running from on that boat? Like, who was chasing them? Like, why were they running off into the forest? Did I miss something?
I don't think so. I think it's just like, we got to get out of here because this was a bad place. The doctor was going to do things to her. I don't know. Basically, they don't need to run at that point, but they do. And they do arrive in a bright place. And it seems like they maybe are going to be in love now. But there hasn't really been a relationship there. There hasn't been a slowly developing bond between them. So I'm not even sure, to be honest, whether they are going to be in love or whether it's just that, hey, they arrive in this good place. It's very puzzling that our hero doesn't actually do any of these things. He doesn't drive the stake through the vampire. He doesn't figure out how to kill the vampire. He doesn't collect the tools. It's really all the older servant. Strange choice.
So what were you saying that the old man said to him? About
which
the girl?
Point?
The one that we can't get on the same page with.
Well, at the very beginning, he says, "She must die."
No, I was right. She must not die.
Really?
Yeah. Can you see my screen? That's what was confusing the hell out of me. Can you see it or no?
I see. Yeah.
She must not die. Because I'm like, what's going on? Did I completely misunderstand the movie?
Well,
you had me so confused.
I was going to say that I think, it's not her, it's not the daughter, but perhaps the old lady,
Mhm,
the old vampire. Maybe that's what he means. But
mhm.
I wonder if we've seen different translations of this movie.
Well, there are different
Um,
translations, that's for
yeah.
sure.
So
Yeah.
I'm
This movie
wondering if,
does have a lot of different versions, but my version says she must not die. And
okay,
that's the premise I was going on. So you kept
yeah.
confusing me. You're saying she must die. Like, who must die? What are you talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, that's what like I said, I thought he was referring to his daughter at first.
Mhm,
Like, and the other guy does say, you must kill her,
mhm.
but wait until daylight. So it kind of made sense. But then I thought, wait a minute, he might be talking about the old vampire woman. But yeah, maybe you're right. And, maybe the translation I saw was off. And maybe it's like, yeah, she can't die. You've got to save her. But regardless, he doesn't really do much. He just kind of observes things. He's not really, I mean, he does get the key and he does let her out of that room. So, in a way, he kind of rescues her, I suppose, at the very end. But other than that, he's not very active. He's really just an observer. That's the best I can say about it.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of an I was just confused. I was like, why are they together? I didn't see one scene that made me think that this was a couple. Who are they running
No.
from? I didn't see any threat to them that made them, oh, we got to get on this boat and we got to run through this forest and then just stare at the sun. Like I didn't see like anything that led up to that. Why weren't
No.
they involved in the killings? I guess you made sense of the disembodied head. I'm like, the
Yeah.
floating head looks cool, but who is it? Like, I didn't even know who that was. I'm just like, oh, a head now. Okay, this is cool, but what? And I guess he turned on one of his henchmen and he was like, he locked him in, like, oh, you fight that disembodied head. Then when he died,
Yeah.
then he ran out. I thought that was hilarious. That was like the
Oh,
only time
yes.
like I really laughed during the movie is when they turned on each other. And
Oh,
after he
yes.
died, he ran away. I thought the end was cool when he got buried underneath all that
Yes.
powdery stuff. Burying to me is super scary because I think that's like a fear like most people have is being buried alive. Or it's so claustrophobic. It reminds you of your own mortality that we're all gonna die, and just the fact that like you're being buried and your death is happening, but you're not ready to go, literally not ready to go,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
just figuratively, you know. So I love the whole buried alive thing earlier when it was Alan, and then later when we see the main guy gets buried alive. So I thought it was a creative death as well. But who's doing all these killings and why were they able to do these killings like after the vampire died? Like it was just really
Yeah.
confusing, man. Really confusing
Yeah.
ending.
Well, I suppose in a way it's like trying to make sense of a very weird David Lynch movie. You can't really do it, right? You can't always make
It
sense of it.
wasn't intended to make sense, right?
Yeah, perhaps. And I just sent you a screenshot of the version I watched in Twitter here, so you can see the screenshot of the
Oh,
line. Yeah.
that's
So
crazy. It's crazy that they have two versions where they leave out one
yeah,
word that changes everything.
I
You
know.
know?
And so now we need somebody who understands German to listen to that soundtrack
And figure
and
out what it
see
was.
what does he actually say there.
Yeah.
But of course,
Because there is a
it was
woman that has to be killed, and there's a woman
yes,
that he should keep alive. So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It can make sense either way,
yeah,
but it's
yeah.
very cryptic in the beginning, though.
Mhm. Yeah. The only reason I thought that it made sense to not make sure she does not die is because if it's she must die, then he had nothing to do with killing. I guess he kind of assisted him, but he didn't
Mhm.
really do much of the work. Like, oh, I see you killing her already. Let me pat you on the
No,
back. Good job. I helped. Yes, you know,
exactly,
I was
exactly.
part of her murder. Yeah. So
He was there for moral support. That's about all. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. But very, very, very confusing end. But overall, great movie. Highly recommend.
absolutely worth it to see the visuals, not for the story so much, but just watch it and let it wash over you, and just enjoy that visual element. It's wonderful.
We're good. We're going to cut off in a few seconds.
All right, we did
Barely
it.
made it. Barely. Shame on you. You came close.
Yes, it was close, but we did it.
We did.
So,
yes. Before we cut off, I had some thoughts on the next movie. I guess we'll handle it on Twitter. I'll tweet you some of the thoughts I had.
Okay.
We're about to cut off with the audio.
Yeah. I was remembering we talked about Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, and you said, "Are you telling me we need to watch that?" So that's something we could watch.